world of ABC Video. A world of exciting programs for you to enjoy and collect. From Australiana to Australian comedy, great sporting events to the great days of steam. A world of entertainment for you to collect now on ABC Video.
During World War II, railways across the world were mobilised to play a vital part in the war effort. Australia's railways were mobilised too, but a network that should have been the nation's greatest asset couldn't cope. 6 different state railways, all running on different gauges, made freight handling at border crossings a circus.
The rails of the clown in this circus ring, tumbling, juggling, dropping the freight, but we're not laughing. Not when Australia's fate is in the balance. Just turn back to 42. Remember? A division of men and equipment bundled into anything on wheels crawled across the flat, bare belly of Australia. Change of gauge clogged up their effort. But all the time, the Japs were coming closer.
When the Americans came here, they looked and they said, well, you got 2 lines, buddy. Why not 1 line to get it through from one city to the other, one state to the other? Well, General MacArthur, when he came through and stayed at the Globe Hotel, said, say, buddy, he said, this is going to help the enemy.
It took World War II to force Australia to recognise its break-of-gauge problems. Yet their origins could be traced all the way back to the dawn of the railway age. A land the size of the USA, with a population of less than 1 million Europeans. That was Australia in the 1840s. 3/4 of the continent remained unknown, unmapped, and unexplored. Outback meant anywhere more than 100 kilometres from a coastal city. To go outback meant an arduous, back-breaking trek. Such inland settlements as there were existed only to grow wool. Sending wool to the coast by bullock dray might take a month, but wool was so valuable that it paid its way. Paddle steamers would soon be plying the inland rivers. Their main cargo would also be wool, the one crop that didn't perish on the slow trip downstream. Every colony wanted more development, but without better transport, the inland seemed destined to remain a sheep run. Australians knew about railways. In Britain, before migrating, some had even ridden on trains like this. It's a replica of Robert Stephenson's rocket, the first successful steam locomotive ever built. By the 1840s, Australia's need for railways was obvious, but no one could see how to pay for them. Then suddenly, almost overnight, everything changed. In February 1851, Australia struck gold. The rush brought new settlers pouring into the country. Population doubled in less than a decade. Suddenly, Australia was rich, and the railway age was finally born. Australia wouldn't become a single nation until 1901. Meanwhile, 6 separate colonial governments would each set out to create a railway system to suit itself. If a colony thought of its neighbour at all, it was as a rival, and it was in that divided spirit that Australia started laying rails. Colonial opinion was equally divided on another great matter, the question of what kind of railway the country should have. At least one school of thought favoured horse-drawn trains. It was the wool growers who favoured draft horsepower. They argued that horses were cheaper than steam locomotives, yet could still haul their wool to town. Fortunately, the more far-sighted disagreed, although Australia's first true railway was in fact just such a line. First opened in 1854, this South Australian railway once carried wool from river steamers to waiting clipper ships. Part of the track at Victor Harbour has been restored as a tourist railway. It's a unique reminder of the kind of trains that most of early Australia nearly had. Horses would never appear on mainline tracks, but they did serve nobly on some private timber and mining lines, even in the 20th century. Melbourne became the first Australian city to actually get up ahead of steam in September 1854. The engine wasn't much bigger than the old rocket. The railway was just 4 kilometres long. It linked Melbourne with her port, in gold rush days Australia's busiest, with Melbourne Australia's fastest growing city. It was a notable first for a city founded only 19 years before. Sydney's steam age began just 1 year later with this locomotive. At Sydney's Powerhouse Museum, Australia's oldest surviving engine attracts almost as much attention today as it did the first time it ran. In 1855, it hauled the first steam train in New South Wales, from Sydney to Parramatta. By then, Sydney had already scored a significant first of its own. A private company had been formed to build the line, but it went bankrupt. The government had to step in to complete the work. As a result, this train ran on the first public railway anywhere in the British Empire to be government-built and run. It was Sydney's first line that set Australia's future trend. Most of the few early private railways would be taken over, and by far the majority of tracks would be government-run from the start. Nor is it hard to see why. Australia's first trains appeared on a raw frontier, one so new and unexplored that the limits of settlement were often defined by the track itself. Railway builders were true pioneers. A railway was often the first road in a wilderness. For private investors, that made railways a very uncertain bet. The chance of profits lay too far in the future. In the long run, government ownership had another significant side effect. It meant that Australians would always see their trains as a community service, not as a paying business. But government commitment to railways brought benefits too. The giant task was attacked on a giant scale. The railways were to become Australia's biggest employer and rail transport its biggest industry. In a period of 80 years, 3,500 locomotives were built in railway workshops around Australia. By the 1930s, trains had fulfilled their promise. They had conquered distances that had held development back for 100 years. They had literally transformed a nation. Australia had laid over 40,000 kilometres of iron rails, ranking 7th in the world for length of track. Not bad going at a time when the country still had a population of only 6 million people. But even as the last rails were being laid, there were warning signs ahead. Motor vehicles were fast becoming part of the transport scene, even on the railway line itself. The arrival of the motor car might not have been such a threat if the vast railway network had already been paid for. But it hadn't. Not even government had the finance to build the tracks Australia needed. Most of the money had been borrowed from overseas. By 1930, those borrowings amounted to the incredible sum for the time of $500 million, representing half of all the funds Australia had ever borrowed overseas. As the Great Depression struck, repayments on those loans would almost bankrupt the country. Australia's railways are still paying off the debts of the past, at least part of which stems from a major miscalculation. Governments in 1890 believed that by 1990, Australia would parallel the American experience and would have a population of 150 million people. The reality is 1/10 of that. Moreover, most Australians still live close to the coast. Inland growth has never quite lived up to expectations. Even without the miscalculations, Australia's railway network was never the grand vision it could have been. As each of the 6 colonial governments laid tracks towards its borders, the main object was often to steal its neighbours' trade. Victoria's motive was exactly that when it first pushed a railway up to its northern border, the Murray River. The Murray had already played a vital role in the development of the outback. The river flows through eastern Australia's agricultural heartland. Providing a border between Victoria and New South Wales, reaching the sea in yet a third colony, South Australia, the Murray was already a riverboat highway before the railway came. Geographically, the Murray was a natural highway to the interior. Politically, the eastern colonies saw the river quite differently. It drained their trade downstream to South Australia. It was to cut this supply line off that Victoria's railways hurried towards the Murray River, reaching Echuca as early as 1864. The port of Echuca is a living memorial to a time when this was the busiest railhead anywhere on the river. The line ran right to the river's edge. It scooped up trade that would otherwise have vanished downstream. Once railways reached the river, the days of the paddle steamer were numbered. In time, the spread of rail would steal the trade of all the river towns. Morgan in South Australia did at least survive until the 1930s. Trains brought travellers and cargo from Adelaide. The boats took them on upstream, but it was typical of the contest between river and rail that paddle steamers could only survive where rail had yet to reach, or when time didn't matter. In 1883, New South Wales Railways also reached the Murray, the colony's southern border, and arrived with some pride, to judge by the grand architecture of Albury Station. In those days, Albury truly was a border station. Every passenger had to pass through customs. Until Federation in 1901, taxes were levied on all goods passing between the states. Even passengers' bags were searched for contraband. The opening of the Sydney to Melbourne line was marked by enthusiastic celebrations. It was, after all, the first time any 2 colonial railways had come together. If Sydney was a rather patronising father and Melbourne an unenthusiastic son, at least the link between the 2 cities was now complete. Well, it was almost complete, because in fact the 2 lines didn't really meet at all. For 30 years, New South Wales and Victoria had been laying their tracks to different gauges. New South Wales had laid all theirs on standard gauge, 4 feet 8.5 inches. Victoria had laid all theirs at a width of 5 feet 3, the so-called broad gauge. Queensland had settled on a narrow gauge, followed by Western Australia, Tasmania and the Northern Territory. South Australia had built both broad and narrow gauge. At Albury, as at nearly every border station, the break of gauge meant no passenger could complete the journey without changing trains. The reason Albury came to have one of the longest and busiest platforms in the world. Being a major bottleneck at least kept Albury Station buzzing with life, as local historian Cliff Chamberlain remembers.
Well, it was chaotic, particularly those trains that were coming in around the midnight, and you can imagine hundreds and hundreds of people, because everybody that travelled in those days, before the days of four-lane highways and aeroplanes, you travelled by train or you didn't travel at all. And changing over with little sleepy children from one train to the other, because everybody changed here. That was the signal that went out, everybody changed, Albury.
Albury, all change! What the hell? Wake the children. Grab a luggage. Find the ticket. Get a porter. We're changing train. We're changing gauge. This is the border. This is the barrier between the states.
They won't be in your purse. I always keep them in this pocket.
Tried looking in your overcoat.
They won't be in my overcoat.
So it was chaos, and then you'd have another crowd that would be building up the platform to get to the refreshment rooms for bangers and mash. So this, I would reckon, without really knowing, that I would imagine that this railway station here at Albury was probably the biggest in Australia. That is outside Sydney and Melbourne.
I won't stay in this train. But we can't be it. Why? Because we have to change into another one. Why? Because this is as far as this one goes. Why? Because it wants a rest. I don't know. Come on. Look in the other suitcase.
No, they won't be in a suitcase. Always keep them in this pocket.
The chaos made Albury an ideal place for celebrity spotting too.
I can remember Billy Hughes being here. Billy Hughes was a Prime Minister that was the caricature artist's favourite, and I've seen him here on a number of occasions. And you'd come up here, you'd see nuns in unusual habit. You'd see people from different lands in the days when we were a white Australian. We didn't see people from other lands. So Albury was the place, the Albury railway station, were the place where you saw the other side of the world. It's very sad to see the station that is so quiet, you know, so few people travelling now, because, you know, most people have got cars, we've got magnificent roads, highways. It's only 3 hours to Melbourne now. And it is a pity, because it was an era, it was more of a romantic era, I think.
Nostalgia adds romance to the past, but the enforced change of trains was at least inconvenient for passengers and a disaster for freight. Every item of freight had to be unloaded and transshipped to cross the border, as railwayman Jeff Hamilton remembers well.
It was a big operation. There was up to about 1,000 men operated over a period of quite a number of years, and through the war. They transshipped everything that you could possibly think of, because there was no transports. Every possible thing in the way of farm machinery, which were done on the 2 cranes, operated 24 hours a day. Fruit from Brisbane markets down to the Melbourne markets. Every possible thing that you could think, I think, was transshipped here, and everything had to be checked with a checker on a checking sheet to make sure that there was no shortages existing from Station A to Station B.
It finally took the dark days of World War II to prove that the situation was dangerous as well as confusing. Even then, it was another 17 years before the problem was finally fixed, at least on this line. In 1962, the Southern Aurora, the first standard gauge train, ran between Sydney and Melbourne, a real cause for celebration. Goods traffic doubled almost overnight, but even today, the gauge trouble isn't over. Although Sydney-Melbourne trains pass straight through Albury, freight bound for most other places in either state still has to be transshipped. For most freight, the method used is the bogie exchange, a complete change of wheels. It's quicker to change the wheels than to unload the car. It's a costly and time-consuming way for a freight train to cross a border. Similar operations slow things down all over Australia, and all because of a minimal difference in track width. A tiny gap that has become a gulf. Born amid the rivalry of the colonial age, broken gauges have bedeviled Australia's railways ever since, and the problem has become harder, not easier to solve. It's not just a question of broken gauges. Declining revenue has left Australia's railways with a whole infrastructure designed for a different age. It's no wonder that the railways are caught in a time warp, trapped somewhere between a museum piece of the past and a transport system of the future. Against the odds, Australia's railways are fighting back. It's even possible that their best years are still to come. But to succeed, they will need a truly national vision. The one vital quality that colonial railway builders lacked. They're working on one of the loneliest and most isolated mainline railways in the world. This is Australia's Nullarbor Plain, literally the plain with no trees. 250,000 square kilometres of saltbush, bluebush and limestone bedrock. It's dry, it's flat, and in summer the temperature can often top 50 degrees Celsius. Just one reason that early railway builders found the task of spanning the continent too difficult. Today, long-haul tracks like this are the nation's most vital rail corridors. Yet for decades they remained the railway system's missing links. On the Nullarbor Plain, trains on Australia's longest rail corridor encounter the longest straight stretch of track in the world, 478 kilometres without a curve. The total corridor is 8 times as long, 4,000 kilometres from Sydney in the east to Perth in the west. The sheer distance helps to make this an almost perfect modern railway. The ideal railway has always been said to run flat and straight between two large cities. In today's competitive transport world, the further apart those cities are, the better. The Transcontinental is in fact the only truly profitable interstate route in the country. Today, tracks like this bind the continent together, yet there were good reasons why they were also among the last rail connections to be made. Most of Australia's early railways would never be linked together, and a major cause of that fragmentation was the character of the continent itself. In almost every case, railways heading inland found themselves in increasingly arid country. Spectacular country lay at Australia's heart, but it would never support the cities and farms that railways needed to pay their way. Discouraged from pushing further inland, too many railways wound up as one-way streets. They had spanned distances that on other continents would have linked a dozen cities, but all they had reached was a tiny railhead. All they had found were seasonal cargoes, wheat or wool or sheep. Even in rail's heyday, a siding at the end of the line could be lucky to see one train a week. Now and then, a railway pushing inland did strike it rich. Set in dry spinifex country 1,000 kilometres from the coast, Mount Isa's copper could only be tapped by rail. In turn, the rich copper field helped the railway pay its way. Perhaps Australia had discovered a new kind of railway, not one that ran between two cities, but from an outback mine to the sea. Certainly in Queensland, heavy mineral hauls were important from the start, and they still are. But this vast and decentralised state was a courageous railway builder in any case, actually laying 10,000 kilometres of track, more than any other state. In the early days, though, Australia's biggest railway system was also its most fragmented. Originally, 5 separate Queensland railways each reached back from a separate coastal port. Today, at least some of these ports are busier than ever. Gladstone in central Queensland is one of the biggest coal loading operations in the world. Even so, an interesting question remains. Why did early railways in all states invariably head inland when most of the population lived close to the coast? The explanation is simple enough. Ships already had the coastal trade tied up. Coastal shipping was well established long before railways came. The ships were close to competitive in speed and certainly on price. Some railways would finally indulge in ruthless price cutting, designed to destroy the private shipping trade. But for a long time, rail stuck to what it did best, linking the outback with the sea. That situation explains why by 1900, Queensland in particular had so many isolated tracks. A coastal line connecting most of them up wasn't completed until 1924. Today, that coastal line is Queensland's busiest. Busy enough to justify two major passenger services, the Sunlander and also the Queenslander, one of Australia's most luxurious travel trains.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, on the Queenslander. Breakfast is about to be served in the dining car. Could all passengers please make their way down now? Just repeating that breakfast is about to be served in the dining car. Thank you.
The sheer scale of the state still makes train travel an attractive option for people as well as freight. The 2,000-kilometre journey from Brisbane to Cairns is still a long way to go by car, and the lush coastal scenery along the way is spectacular too. Not only does the train link a dozen coastal cities along the way, at the end of its run, it reaches Cairns. From the beginning, most Australian trains headed inland, and if they were sometimes destined to end up nowhere much, they also faced challenges just getting out of town. Behind all the East Coast capital cities ran the Great Dividing Range, mountains that had to be crossed before trains could serve the hinterland. Sydney was an extreme case. Mountains to south and west, and north of the city, trains faced a water hazard as well. The wide and swift-flowing Hawkesbury Estuary wasn't bridged until 1889. No less challenging were the rugged sandstone tablelands that enclosed Sydney on every side, battlements that seemed impassable at first. Steep grades, deep cuttings, long tunnels and tight curves. Even today, this difficult terrain still affects rail operations in New South Wales. The cost of maintaining and upgrading lines like these is monumental. Back in the 1860s, the challenge of crossing these mountains at all seemed monumental in itself. Railway engineers came up with a solution that left New South Wales with a remarkable legacy. Now bypassed, this track, called a zigzag, was opened in 1869 and judged at the time to be one of the engineering wonders of the railway world. Preserved by enthusiasts, this zigzag was one of two. They were designed to get traffic up to the tableland and down the other side. This western zigzag let trains climb and descend a sheer rock face that barred the way to western New South Wales. It was an ingenious solution, as volunteer driver Michael Forbes explains.
Back in the 1860s, when they were putting the railway over the mountain, they got to the top of the hill at Clarence, and then they had to get the railway down to the Lithgow Valley floor. It's about 600 feet. The only way they could do it was to carve a giant Z in the side of the hill, i.e. build a zigzag. And this was a series of ramps. The top road was the top bar of the Z, middle road was the middle bar of the Z, and bottom road was the bottom bar of the Z, and these sloped gently down towards Lithgow at an angle that could be safely negotiated by a loaded steam locomotive and train. Right to go.
Constant shunting simply adds to the fun for modern enthusiasts. But back when the zigzag was part of the main line, it could also be time-consuming, particularly as traffic grew. Crossing the mountains meant 4 shunts. The line was single track, and trains on the zigzag had to contend with steep grades as well.
At the moment we're on the steepest part of the track. The gradient up here goes from a constant rise of about 1 in 44 to 1 in 34, and you'll hear the engine start to labour in a second. Hear the hill having its effect on us. It's starting to slow us down, and I've got my hand on the sanding valve because if the wheels start to slip, I get some sand under it and keep the traction on the brake.
The zigzags actually served the main line for only 40 years. They'd been a vital link in the railway chain, but finally sheer traffic congestion forced them to close. By 1910, both zigzags had been replaced by tunnels. Today, those tunnels still form part of Australia's transcontinental route. With 4,000 kilometres still to go, the Indian Pacific Passenger Express, bound for Perth, has already tackled the toughest grades of its journey, just 2 hours out of Sydney. The Transcontinental has a unique edge as a travel train. Its 3-day journey from coast to coast offers passengers a remarkable slice of the real Australia. Beyond the divide, the Indian Pacific does find country where it can at last run flat and straight. And it's out of these endless plains, half a day later, that the train's first major destination finally appears. In the 1890s, Broken Hill, 1,200 kilometres west of Sydney, saw the richest silver strike on Earth. Vast deposits that, along with lead and zinc, have been mined intensively ever since. In theory, Broken Hill, like Mount Isa, was exactly the kind of outback prize that railways sought. But in fact, the town was so remote from Sydney that the first New South Wales Railway didn't reach here until 1927. And by then, South Australia had already stepped in to claim the prize. By 1927, Broken Hill had already been a boomtown for 30 years. And for all that time, most of the benefits of that prosperity had gone to South Australia. Most unusually of all, they had done so thanks to a private railway. Officially, South Australia's trains could only run as far as the border town of Coburn, 50 kilometres short of Broken Hill. A private company offered to fill the gap. They built what they euphemistically called the Silverton Tramway, but it was a heavy haul railway in all but name. The tramway continued to serve for nearly 80 years, and some of its heritage is preserved at Broken Hill's Railway Museum. After 1927, the line supplied a missing link between the public railways of South Australia and New South Wales. And according to museum curator Ron Carter, it also set an example to both.
They worked the main line from the South Australian border to Broken Hill during the whole of their life, and each year they made a profit, whereas the government railway systems on either side showed huge deficits. The Silverton Tramway Company, over those 82 years of mainline operation, made a handsome profit. Probably because private enterprise tend to get more out of people and machines than government railways. All of the Silverton Tramway Company's locomotives were loaded to their absolute maximum on the main line, and when they'd stop, they'd take one truck off, and that was the set load. That was the way they set the loads for all their mainline trains. All their people worked very hard, and I think it was probably because the company used to show attention to detail.
The Silverton Tramway still exists, not on the main line, but the company provides shunting and marshalling services around Broken Hill. It's a company with a remarkable legacy. By the time mainline operations ceased in 1969, it had become the most profitable Australian railway ever built. The reason the Silverton Tramway survived so long was that even when New South Wales trains did reach Broken Hill, they could go no further. They ran on standard gauge, and the tramway was narrow gauge. As so often in Australia, it was a case of all change please, with the tramway gaining the benefit.
And if you wanted to catch a train from Sydney to Adelaide, you had to come via the standard gauge to Broken Hill, and then included in your fare, of course, was a taxi fare from the Crystal Street station across to the Sulphide Street station where we are at the moment. That was the Silverton Tramway Company's passenger terminal at Broken Hill. And then you'd catch the narrow gauge train from Broken Hill down to Tarawi, where you would, of course, change then into the broad gauge 5'3" train for the journey to Adelaide.
The Indian Pacific still changes locos at Broken Hill, but passengers can stay on board. The line from Sydney to Perth was finally converted to standard gauge in 1969. A year later, the Indian Pacific became the first passenger train ever to cross Australia from coast to coast. The locos that take over here are those of the AN Line, Australia's national railway. 24 hours ahead is the Nullarbor Plain, and it was the national government that originally built the track. Early this century, it was the need to build a railway across the Nullarbor that first brought the federal government onto the railway scene. Without this track, Australia's railways would have been left with a vital missing link. But for a long time, it was a line that no state government had the will to build. The challenges of cost and distance were horrendous. State governments saw railways as a way of promoting settlement, and there was little to encourage settlement out here. Clearly enough, in the interests of national unity, the track that no one else would lay would have to be built by the federal government. And so, in 1912, the assault on the Nullarbor began. In those days, the Nullarbor Plain was a no-man's land, camel country, and it was with camels that surveyors began to mark out the line of track. A human army followed, reshaping the landscape as it went. The track that was laid and how it was laid has been a source of legend ever since. Picks and shovels against the desert, mass movement of men and materials into country that only a handful of Europeans had ever seen. Men working in some of the most inhospitable country on earth still managed to set some remarkable records. The most railway ever laid in the world in a day, a month, a year. In the process, Australia's infant steel industry also found its feet, supplying the huge demand for rails. In 1917, the Trans-Nullarbor Railway opened for business. The trains were as luxurious as any of their time, but they were still part of a piecemeal system. To get this far, passengers from Sydney had already changed trains no less than 5 times. Today, the Indian Pacific is a true transcontinental. But the train does still make one stop on the Nullarbor Plain. Station Master Merv Gould can rightly claim to be a leading citizen of this tiny settlement, because the only reason that he and a handful of other people live out here is to serve the trains. This is Cook, a town whose only real attraction is that it's about as remote as a town can be.
Hello, Bill.
Thank
Whenever
you.
you're ready, you're right to go.
Okay.
Okay. See you next time.
Yeah.
For passengers, the stop at Cook is a highlight of the Indian Pacific adventure. Trains also refuel here, and drivers change. But that's routine. For most passengers, this is a once-in-a-lifetime stopover. In 2 full days, the Indian Pacific has travelled just over halfway across Australia. With 2 more days to Perth, it's about now that the passengers start to realise the scale of the continent and the magnitude of the challenge the early railway builders faced. Standard gauge came to the transcontinental just in time. 100 years ago, railways began the process of shrinking the continent. Their present economic survival depends on long-haul routes like this. And for the future, rail will not depend on passenger trains like the Indian Pacific. It will be heavy freight, hauled across distances daunting even to modern road transport. And ironically, rail's survival now depends on the very tracks that were once the railway's missing links. Those golden days are vanished, and altered is the scene. The diggings are deserted, the camping grounds are green. The flaunting flag of progress is in the west unfurled. The mighty bush with iron rails is tethered to the world. The poet Henry Lawson wasn't too pleased to see railways tethering his beloved bush, but most Australians welcomed them with open arms. The coming of trains signalled an end to social and economic isolation and the beginning of a farming revolution. If the future of rail lies with long hauls and mainline routes, much of its past lay with tracks just like this one. They were never major rail corridors, they were called pioneer lines. And for many outback towns, they were the first reliable link with the outside world. Down pioneer lines flowed the wealth of a nation, from farm, forest and mine. From remote communities that would never have existed without their railway and could never have prospered without their trains. Australia prospered too, as the Iron Horse brought an ever-increasing range and tonnage of primary products down to the sea. Exports boomed. In every Australian state, pioneer lines rather than intercapital city links were the government railway's first objective. Tracks that reached out both to open up the hinterland and to tap its wealth. Finally, Pioneer lines alone would comprise a remarkable 20,000 kilometres of track. It seemed there was almost nowhere worth settling that railways couldn't reach. Today, those same pioneer lines are vanishing. Changing times have seen many railways outlive their purpose, although happily there are exceptions to every rule.